A turning point for Thailand. For the seventh day, pro-democracy activists in Bangkok braving a ban on demonstrating. This despite a tightening of the screws on independent media. Why are young people so determined? How does the biggest mass mobilization since the 2014 coup perhaps differ from what we've seen in the past there? What's changed? Well, for starters, Thailand has a new king. And in a land where criticizing the monarchy can lead to up to 15 years in jail, many protesters who are suffering through times of COVID are now unafraid to call out the playboy lifestyle of Maha Vajiralongkorn. Where does it leave Thailand's coup leader turned civilian prime minister, Prayut Chan-o-cha? How fast are the fault lines of Thai politics changing? Could the country actually return to democracy? Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking if it's a turning point for Thailand. We invited the Thai embassy here in Paris to join us. They did not respond to that invitation. Joining us from Bangkok, though, Phil Robertson, Deputy Director of Human Rights Watch's Asia Division. Thanks for being with us.
Of course, happy to be here.
From Copenhagen, Shini Pimlapa, spokesperson for the Free Thai movement in Denmark. There are Free Thai movements, I know, throughout Europe and the world that have been springing up. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
And it's always a pleasure to welcome back David Camroux, Honorary Senior Research Fellow at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. How are you?
Pleasure to be back with you, Francois.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Yeah, fewer protesters in the streets of the Thai capital this Tuesday, a slight easing of tension, but it may just be a lull. There was the release of two of the main protesters. There were of several protesters, but the two most prominent ones were immediately rearrested on other charges. Organizers have warned, by the way, of, quote, a surprise if their demands aren't met. Last Friday definitely marked a turning point. There was an uptick of violence, water cannons deployed after the government announced emergency powers to ban protests. And I'll begin with you, Phil Robertson. Is there that sense that it is a lull right now, but there's more to come?
Well, there is now going to be a special session of the parliament. So there is going to be a movement of the discussion to the parliament to possible changes to the constitution. This is something that the parliamentarians were pushing the government to consider. The government now had a cabinet meeting and decided to go forward with that, and the king has approved. So that is going to be the next sort of step here in the political process in Thailand. It's unclear how that will take place, who will be involved, whether some of the leaders from the protests will be invited to the parliament to have their views heard and to respond to what the parliamentarians are saying. But this is, I think, certainly a lull, because that is the way that the political establishment now has responded, is that, okay, there is now a forum to talk. Let's see what people are willing to say.
A forum to talk, but is it anything more? Because I read, Phil, that this was going to be a non-voting session. Is that correct?
Well, I think that there's going to be discussions. I don't think that there's actual specific legislation or constitutional amendments on the table yet. They're trying to search for a process for a dialogue. And the big question is whether the government is sincere in trying to engage with the protesters or not. But there has to be an attempt made. I think that's what the parliamentarians are saying. And we will know after that session in probably about a week's time, whether, in fact, there is any sort of common ground for dialogue, or whether there's going to be more and more protests. I think the protests will continue while this dialogue is going on, but certainly it does offer a bit of a lull to the action while there's a potential of discussions.
Shini Pimplapas, when the protesters talk of a possible surprise, what could they mean?
Do you mean the possible surprise of today? Yes, actually, for the past 3 or 4 days, they announced meeting point every day for the protester, the gathering, and this is a game of, I would say, the game of the mouse mouse and clumsy cat. So for they actually announce where they're going to meet just a few minutes, a few hours, and then people already there. So the police actually, they were too late to block where they want to go. But for the surprise today, because they announced where to meet every day, and the surprise there is we gonna rest and we're gonna come back tomorrow if our deal is not going to be done at all from the government. That's the surprise today. Of course, the police call and everyone, they're ready to arrest them, but no one there. That's the big surprise.
And what do you think of Parliament now being given a voice? Is that a good thing?
Yes, it's always a good thing that they run something on the Parliament, but this amendment of the Constitution has been talked for months or more than that, and especially they have a draft from the opposition party that already proposed to the government, and also a draft of their constitution from the people that the organization called iLaw has been collect the signatures, and also the copy of ID of more than 100,000 people is already there, that draft. But the parliament doesn't care. Okay, one of the things from the constitution amendment is that the senators have to agree to amend. But how can the senator agree to amend something that gonna take them out of the power? I don't see that coming. How can they gonna vote for the law that's gonna get them out from the seat that they're sitting right now?
So, David Cameron, is this basically, stalling tactic?
It is partly a stalling tactic, and the government has got what it's reaped what it's sown, because it banned the main opposition, one of the important opposition parties, Future Forward, which is very much supported by the same young people who are demonstrating. So it got rid of a legal way of expressing opposition within the parliament, and therefore, people go to the streets. So the parliament is something of just a talk shop, and the Senate is nominated, is not elected. So there's not much, in a sense, to be really hoped from the parliament, unless, and that's the big question, is the nexus going to be broken between the king, who is, unpopular, unlike his father, is not loved or appreciated either by the people or even by those who support him. They support the monarchy, but they don't, and the figurehead, but they don't necessarily like him as a person. And the army and the top of the civil service, and unfortunately the judiciary. Now, which part of that nexus is going to weaken, and who's going to sacrifice whom?
And you get the sense that there's carrot and stick this Tuesday. Voice TV, which is close to exiled former Premier Thaksin Shinawatra, one of 4 media organizations ordered to shut because of their reporting on the ongoing protest movement. The Foreign Correspondents Club of Thailand expressing deep concern. The Prime Minister, well, he explained his decision.
เรื่องของการทำความเข้าใจนะครับส่วนบางอันที่จำเป็นต้องปิดตามคำสั่งก็ต้องปิดนะครับเพราะได้ดำเนินการมาอย่างต่อเนื่องนะผมไม่ได้ไปละเมิดใครทั้งสิ้นหน้าที่ของผมแล้วก็พวกเราทุกคนก็คือเราต้องช่วยกันป้องกันกำจัดการกระทำที่มีเจตนาร้ายกับประเทศความพยายามที่จะยุยงปลุกปั่นสร้างความวุ่นวายความแตกแยกศัตรูมาภายในประเทศนั่นคือสิ่งที่เราต้องไม่ยอมรับให้เกิดขึ้นนะครับ
Everyone has the duty to protect and eliminate harmful intention in the country that create or incite chaos. Right now, former General Prayut, what's his position? Does he have all the cards still?
He doesn't have all the cards insofar as the king has, in a sense, partly not marginalized, but pushed him a little bit aside. He's taken 2 of the battalions directly under his command, the battalions which traditionally were involved in coup d'etat. And he's, of course, taken the control of the Crown Property Trust, 30 or 40 billion US dollars, richest monarch in the world. So the Prime Minister doesn't have all the cards, but in the sense they depend on each other. It's a bit like Trump and the Republican Party.
Because when we were, in the past, when we had the red shirts against the yellow shirts, right, you had the military and these hardline royalists, and they had a lock on power. Is that not the case anymore?
It's not on the case, and it's interesting that the government is not using the army. The army is used against, the most unequal country of Asia, is used against the poor and the peasantry. And so far, it's the police who are being used to control the demonstrations. That suggests something about the views of the military about what's happening. And the other question is, whether the king can really remain where he is. I mean, if he returns to Germany, isn't there a possibility of something happening while he's away? Years ago, there was a scenario being worked on that, because people knew he was so unpopular, that the crown princess would be appointed as regent. She's very popular. And that one of his sons would be appointed as a minor on the throne or be crowned. That is not, to be neglected, but that we're in sort of something of a science fiction scenario there.
Yeah, so much has changed since 2016 and the death of King Bhumibol. Last week's protest ban was followed an incident that would have been unthinkable under the previous king, the jeering of the Queen's motorcade. And these images posted to Twitter, and you could see people saying, our taxes, and you see that three-fingered salute. That three-fingered salute, Shini Pimplapas, is a nod to Hunger Games, I believe?
Yes, it's from the movie Hunger Games, where they also fight against dictatorship. And that three fingers mean freedom, liberty, and fraternity. And that's they use a lot for these protests.
Yeah,
and I will say something to you about these three fingers. Today, the Prime Minister himself by an individual ties who showed this to him three fingers, and what he told the people of Thailand that when they pass by himself, they say, okay, if your son seeing you do this, he's gonna be ashamed of you as a father. That's what he told the people when they see people doing this three finger to him today.
Phil Robertson, how's that three fingers being interpreted across Thai society? Not everybody's out in the streets.
I think that there is very broad support for change and reform in Thai society. The fact that there was a real outpouring of support after the government ordered the Border Patrol police to crack down on the protesters in Siam Square with the use of the water cannon last week. I mean, that really was, I think, a mistake by the government, and there was a popular reaction against that. There was a lot of criticism in the press. There was a lot of criticism from the international community that the government was going too far, that it was, using violence against peaceful protesters, and that had to stop. And the other important thing to recognize is that these are youth-led protests. And so there is very strong support traditionally within Thailand for students having a more ideological, sort of reformist, activist role. And there's a lot of support for that. And so the government has to really be careful that it doesn't overplay its hand and it doesn't use violence against these protesters, because these are people's children. And there are a lot, not just college students, but also high school students in these crowds who are out there every day using the three-finger salute and demanding reform. So the government,
do you agree on that point? Do you agree on that?
Flummoxed.
Do you agree on that point with David Cameron when he says it is significant that it's the police that's out and not the army?
Well, I mean, if the army comes out, then we're going to see a sort of a different sort of outcome. But I mean, traditionally, the Border Patrol police have been close to the palace as well. So, I mean, I wouldn't make too much about which unit is coming out at this point. The reality is that there is still some unity of control within the government. And I think so far there hasn't been a decision to let the government try to sort it out. If they can't sort it out, then we'll probably see some movement by other parts of the equation, which involves the army and the palace.
And this is a nation where we have had 12 coups in the space of
Since the end of the absolute monarchy in 1932, which involved an alliance between students and intellectuals and the army, which shouldn't be forgotten.
So we've had democracy come and go in Thailand.
Yes, and I mean,
How does it usually happen? What's the script?
well, there's a kind of a cycle of a coup, which leads to an interim constitution, followed by an election, and then that is followed afterwards by another coup and another interim constitution. So there's been a cycle which has been analysed by Thai Thai political scientists on the phenomena in Thailand.
And so where are we right now in the cycle? I mean, can it follow a straight cycle, or are we into something new and something uncharted?
I think we're into something new because, I mean, this is a youth-led protest. There is amongst youth they're just fed up with this incredibly paternalist society, and Prayut makes things worse by treating them as children. I mean, he talks to young people who are very sort of globalized, or very on social media. As if they're still somehow children, and there is a kind of a generational aspect to this, which makes me think that there's something more significant going on here than just the usual cycle of one elite changing the other under these cycle of coup d'état.
Shini Pimpalapas, before we go to the break, though, let me ask you: is this going to be viewed simply as something, well, yeah, from the young students who are in the big cities, but that's far from the concerns of poor people that are far from Bangkok?
Yeah, this movement is not only Bangkok. Everyone in Thailand is already wide awake. We already eyes opening we're not going to be close our eyes again. So it's not only in Bangkok, it's everywhere. Just yesterday, the protesters yesterday in Bangkok, there are like 3 or 4 sites, I don't remember, but the rest of the country, in different countries, in the big university, they have lots of students gathering to protest at the same time. And from the Facebook of the Free Youth page yesterday, they claimed that around the country yesterday, there almost like 1 million people they're protesting yesterday.
Almost 1 million people yesterday protesting. When we come back, we're going to pick up on that point. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We're wondering if Thailand's reaching a turning point with the young pro-democracy demonstrators who've been defying a protest ban for the past 7 days now. We're talking about it with Phil Robertson, who joins us from Bangkok, Deputy Director of Human Rights Watch's Asia Division. From Copenhagen, Shini Pimplapas is spokesperson for the Free Time movement in Denmark. And here in the studio, David Cameron, Honorary Senior Research Fellow at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. You were mentioning this new king who came to power in 2016. Protesters have been openly questioning his lifestyle. Earlier this month, the Financial Times, in an article entitled "The $40 Billion Question," starting its story with the date of Saturday, June 16th, 2018. That was the day the monarch decided to personally appropriate all crown properties and assets. The Economist last week reporting that for 2021, the government's drawn up a budget of $1.1 billion for the monarchy. By comparison, Britain's Queen Elizabeth cost her taxpayers less than a tenth of that, $87 million last year. Precise details on where the money goes are elusive. Huge sums go to pay for royal transport alone. And boy, Phil Robertson, that number has been ingrained in everyone's head. 38, as in 38 aircraft owned by the king?
Well, that's right. That was the Financial Times reporting. It's quite unclear exactly all the dimensions of these aircraft, because in the past we've heard Thai Airways say, "Oh no, that's our aircraft," or the Air Force will say, "No, that's our aircraft." So the reality is we don't have much clarity on that beyond what the Financial Times brought out.
Not much more clarity, but we have seen in the past sort of inklings of it. David Cameron, what have you found with your research?
Well, I mean, it's not just the aircraft, but it's the fundamental problem about the king is that there is this enormous gulf between the notion of a Dharmaraja, of a just and righteous king, the father of the nation, which was the role his father played so effectively for over 60 years, and the behavior of this playboy, who's not only a playboy, but he has a vicious streak. I mean, he's disowned 4 of his own children. And he's arrested part of one of his families-in-law. So this has become totally unacceptable, and at a time when people are suffering under COVID, and the discrepancies in this society, the inequalities in this society, have just come to the fore in this period.
You mentioned just a few minutes ago the overly paternalistic tone of the Prime Minister. Let's listen to the King. This was last Friday. He was broadcast on television speaking to former communists. This was, remember, the same day that those water cannons were being deployed in Bangkok. Phil Robertson, just to remind our viewers, we're talking about a country where there's what's called a crime of lèse-majesté. You can spend up to 15 years in prison for criticizing the monarchy. How did the words we just heard land with Ordinary Ties? Is it something that they talk to you about openly?
Not really so much. I mean, I think that people have really made an art form out of talking between the lines about the monarchy here in Thailand. And I think that, it is, the kind of the broadcast that this was shown on. This is the royal broadcast that's shown every night at 8 p.m. It is news from the palace, and it's shown on all the major TV stations. So this is something that the state is actively promoting. That line about all people need to love not only the country but also the monarch, and it's not surprising that they are continuing in this line. The question is whether the Thai people are going to continue to accept that or not.
You say they've made an art form of not directly talking about it. I know that there's code words. He spends so much time in Germany that he's been nicknamed the German sometimes. But we did hear from especially one of those 2 imprisoned protest leaders, nicknamed the Penguin. We've heard him bluntly criticizing the king. Did that surprise you?
I think it surprised a lot of people about how open some of the protest leaders have been about the monarchy. I think that they've been very clear that they want to have a reform process, which also includes all aspects of the state here, and that does include, of course, the monarchy. And that is controversial. Many have said in some parts of the more conservative quarters of the society, they say, look, if you want to raise the issue of having the government resign or change the constitution, go ahead, but don't talk about the monarchy. And this is something that some of the youth are saying, look, we're going to talk about everything. We're going to change everything. We're going to reform everything. And this is something that I think has really expanded the parameters of the discussion about the state and the monarchy in Thailand over the past really 6 weeks to 2 months.
Now, German media have reported extensively that the king is renting, in fact, a hotel in Garmisch-Partenkirchen. That's in the Bavarian Alps. Regional lawmakers there questioning whether he owed inheritance tax regarding how much time he spends in Germany. The German foreign minister, Heiko Maas, on the floor of the Bundestag back on October the 7th, said, "We've made it clear that politics concerning Thailand should not be conducted from German soil. If there are guests in our country that conduct their state business from our soil, we would always want to act to counteract that." David Cameron, he didn't go any further than that. And right now, the king is, of course, in Thailand, not in Germany. You're saying there could be trouble if he leaves Thailand?
It's a possibility. The question is, this discourse about loving the king and loving the country is fine, but love is a two-way street. And by his behavior, the king has shown no love or respect for his people. And I think that is perhaps the tipping point. This again, he's the exact opposite to his father, who was very careful in cultivating this image of the father of the people and his love for the people. And so, the chickens have come home to roost, so to speak, since his coronation.
Shri Pimplapas, right now, that constitutional discussion, how far should it go in Thailand? How far should the reform go?
Yes. Yes. The government, the protesters has very simple 3 demands to the government. First, the Prime Minister Prayut need to get out as soon as possible. The constitution needs to be drafted, and the reform of the monarchy, which is very simple because if Thailand is still calling itself democracy, should we have the monarchy under the constitution, just like the monarchy of UK or even the monarchy of Denmark? It's a very simple thing and a normal thing to ask. And if it happens, like if it becomes something that difficult and abnormal to do in Thailand. And I want to go back to what you talk about, that the talking about the monarchy and reform, it has been done for a long time ago. Since do you know the Facebook page called Royalist Marketplace, which is opened by the Thai scholar who worked in Kyoto University and then political exile. He opened this page for people to openly talk about monarchy, and this page has more than 1 million people. And then the Minister of Digital forced Facebook to shut down this page. And you know what? He just opened another one, and within few hours, 500,000 people moved to that new page. I would say that's like the biggest migration online in the history, probably. So, but anyway, this reform and this talking and discussion about the monarchy, it has been openly talking among Thai people online or on site with a lot of people. And the protesters on the street some months ago, especially with the human rights lawyer, Anon Nampa, he actually put the limit, put the feeling away from Thailand. And from that day, everyone and every protesters, everyone that's talking on the stage, they talk about this reform of the monarchy. Something that become abnormal, something that become dangerous, now it's going to be something normal. We just ask Thailand to be a normal constitutional country.
David Cameron?
In 1997, there was something called the People's Constitution, which was really quite a democratic constitution, and in which, the king was a constitutional monarch without these powers that the present king has requested. I think what the government is worried about at the moment, and the military and the upper levels of the civil service, is a convergence between the student movement and basically what we call the red shirts, but basically, the peasantry and the dispossessed and the landless, the people suffering the most because of the pandemic. And that will become something really much more difficult to deal with, because historically, the Thai military has not been adverse at killing the peasantry. They've been a bit more reticent in killing members of the bourgeoisie.
Phil Robertson, what is it about COVID? Because we're seeing these leaderless protests around the world that have popped up since the beginning of the pandemic. Lagos, Nigeria is just the latest example of it, but we've seen it across in Europe, in the United States. In the case of Thailand, how much of a COVID effect is there, and why?
Well, there was a significant progress before COVID when the Future Forward Party was dissolved in February. And there was a protest movement that was coming up at that time. And then it was interrupted by COVID, particularly in March and April, when much of Thailand shut down in some ways. Now, Thailand has not experienced a second wave, luckily. Their number of positive cases in the country is just a little bit over 3,600 all in since the beginning of the pandemic, and less than 60 deaths. So the success that Thailand has had at actually controlling COVID-19 so far in some ways has also allowed for these protesters to really go back out on the streets. And it is quite clear that the people are suffering economically here. This is a country that between 15 to 20% of their GDP was dependent on tourism. And the reality is that tourists are not here anymore. In some of the sort of traditional tourist areas in Bangkok and certainly down in the resort areas in Phuket, it's a ghost town. People are really suffering. And I think that there's concern, not just in Thailand, but also other countries around the region, that when you have a significant economic downturn, that signals a loss of legitimacy and authority for the government in power. And certainly there's fear that these protests by these ideologically minded students who are really trying to change things will also link up with various different grievances of people who have lost their livelihoods and become a much larger movement. And it's quite clear that this is a national movement now. I mean, we saw protests the other day, not just in Bangkok and other major cities, but in provincial towns, places like Prachinburi on the Khmer border or, Sarapuri in the Central Plains. I mean, these are places where you don't usually see protests, but there are protests breaking out there by these students. And it's the same sort of coalition of reformers backed by others with grievances.
80% of people in the tourist industry have lost their jobs, 80%.
And it could get worse if they listen to those who are involved with the hashtag Milk Tea Alliance, which is trending in Thailand, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. Students using their shared passion for sweet tea drinks to show solidarity, defy authorities, and make more threats when it comes to tourism.
Thailand is not the place that only for Hong Kongers to have our leisure trip or just for our travel purpose anymore. Thai people in Thai is also a place that really inspire Hong Kongers a lot to continue our fight for freedom. And we urge the world to stand with activists and protesters who are under greater suppression.
Your reaction, Shiri Pimlapas, to listening to Joshua Wong's statement of solidarity from Hong Kong?
I'm very happy to hear that, really. So it's, yes, the youth, the young people in Thailand, they still want to fight. But I would say, let me start with what I'm wearing right now. The T-shirt I'm wearing right now, it represents the journey of democracy of Thailand. Each dot here represents each year of important event in Thailand. You can see that there is not many continuous journey of democracy in Thailand. And right now we are in the breaking point. Either it's going to be just another dot here, or it's going to be a continued democracy. So yes, we have many people in Thailand, the youth are protesting, but the military, the one who has power, they still have gun. And especially back there 10 years ago, the one that cracked down the protester, the red shirt protester 10 years ago, was the one that are right now the Prime Minister of Thailand. So who know that he's going to repeat this tragic once again. So I'm very happy that I see our alliance from all the country that stand with us. So I would really like the world community to keep an eye in Thailand, to stand with us to prevent any violence that could happen to the youth or the protester of Thailand, and more importantly, prevent any possible coup that might happen again.
Because your fear is that there would be another coup, even though it's, the last coup leader who right now is in charge?
I cannot say it's going to be or not, but I cannot certain about anyone who has gun.
David Cameron.
And he used it before.
Phil Robertson?
I would add to that, I mean, there has been speculation that at some point, another more conservative figure might replace the prime minister. This is certainly something that has been rumored in the past. There's no clear facts to sort of pin down behind those rumors, but this is something that has been said in the past. And so it's entirely possible that you could have something happen. But again, we don't see that right now. I mean, right now we're in a bit of a lull. I think that the protests are going to continue. But the reality is that there is a lot of dissatisfaction, and the military, the police, and others are trying to find a way to repress these protests. Their latest effort is to try to shut down some of the various different media outlets that have been broadcasting from the front lines of the protests. They're also trying to take down Telegram groups, the Free Youth group on Telegram that people are using to communicate. They're grasping at straws. How can they try to contain this? How can they try to control this? And so far, they have not been successful at all.
So far, they haven't been successful at all. And David Cameron, when we're having this whole discussion, and we saw we heard Joshua Wong in Hong Kong commenting. We've talked about this before on this very set, which is Thailand's soft power is a strange mix, isn't it? Because it's a country that all of Asia looks at.
It is indeed, and there is some spillover effect in Malaysia at the moment, where there also is a youth movement, which was there before, but it's become a little more agitated, and also in Indonesia over the labour laws that have been introduced. So I think there is some spillover effect elsewhere in Southeast Asia. And also the students themselves in Bangkok have learnt some of the lessons from Hong Kong. In fact, the way the demonstrations are organised spontaneously is following the model which was worked out by the democracy movement in Hong Kong. Fortunately, we don't have China who's going to intervene in Thailand the way they did in Hong Kong. But so yes, the government's in this almost whack-a-mole kind of mood, which is okay. You stop some of the conventional media, but when people are using social media or even just their normal cell phones, there's difficulties in this.
Yeah, so it works as long as it's a leaderless protest, right? The students can stay one step ahead of the game. When there is a leader, though, what happens at that point? And in particular, you mentioned that reformist bloc in Parliament that was banned at the start of the year.
Well, if the government is serious about negotiating, you've got to negotiate with somebody, and this is the problem of a leaderless movement. So at some point, they're going to have to talk to somebody about the 10 demands and the 10 demands of the student movement and of others. And from what I think has been said here, we've seen that the movement has large-scale support within Thailand. It's not revolutionary. They're not asking for Thailand to become a republic. They're asking for it to be a normal, as Siri was saying, a normal constitutional monarchy.
All eyes are turning, Phil Robertson, to the leader of the Future Forward Parliament, who is the Future Forward Party, who was banned from Parliament back in February. What's his status? What's his future?
You're talking about Thanathorn. Well, Thanathorn is no longer a member of Parliament. He was put out with a number of the leaders of the party when it was dissolved. But other parts of the party, which were elected and directly from constituencies, are in fact still in the Parliament. So there is a smaller group of MPs from the future movement that are still there. And then there's an external group, an advocacy group that Thanathorn is leading. They are not in the leadership of these protests. I mean, I think they are playing a role perhaps behind the scene, being supportive, but the reality it's the students that are in charge. And there is a group of reformers, some of the prominent student activists who are, I guess, would constitute the leadership. But it is a very, very movement that is one that is very fluid. They're taking very clearly the lesson from Hong Kong to be water. And that means that different groups are organizing different areas. And so it may be more difficult to have negotiations. Certainly the way that the Thai government deals with protests is that they always go after the leaders. And so these protests have really, in some ways, puzzled the leaders. They don't really understand, like, okay, where are the leaders that we have to go after? Who are we supposed to intimidate? And when you have people who are coming out because they're communicating via Telegram and finding out 20 minutes or half an hour where the flash mob's going to be, the reality is that the authorities have no way to respond to that.
Shini Pimlapas, it'll be the final word.
Yes.
Do you need a leader right now?
You mean what leader?
A leader for the protest movement? Is there need to be a figurehead?
No, I don't think so. Everyone in the protesters, they are leaders. The government arrest all the leaders now. So far, there are right now 87 people at least got arrested. And they're still going on, the protester. They still have a new people to speak out, to lead the movement. So basically, everyone in the movement, they are the leaders. So this is not like the previous protester where you have the actual leader. There's no leader here. If you arrest someone, there are going to be more and more. And let me comment more on the intention of the government to actually want to negotiate or not. Let me tell you something. Yeah. The next day after the Prime Minister announced the emergency decree, they told the protester, don't challenge the angel of death. You can die anytime. This is not the intention of negotiation at all.
All right, we'll leave it with that word. Shini Pimlapas, I want to thank you for joining us from Copenhagen. Phil Robertson for staying up late in Bangkok. I want to thank as well David Camero for being with us. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24.